Welcome to Beirut, 1983. A place of turmoil, a place of death. Bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings were the order of the day, but war in Lebanon was anything but cold.
Annie Jacobsen, thank you so much for doing this, and congratulations on New York Times bestseller, Nuclear War. It keeps coming back on. It keeps jumping on, getting back on the list, and every time you do a big interview, more people find out about it. So I want to encourage everybody to go and read all your books, but particularly this latest, Nuclear War. Of course, James, thank you so much for this last 2 years partnership together, working on this book right here, Targeted Beirut, first in a series of nonfiction books about terrorist events that really changed the course of history, and trying to capture those lessons learned so future generations don't have to relearn those lessons in blood. And for people watching, they can see James's books right here behind me, right there, and then Annie's books right there, the collection right behind me there. So thank you both so much for doing this. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing, guys. It is so amazing to be here. And I have to say, how dare you enter my wheelhouse of nonfiction, Jack? And, James, of course, you live here already. But, and I mean that as a huge compliment, because this is a powerful book, and it's really, it's a gripping read. And I can't wait to get into it. We're going to have to delicately balance spoiler alerts, right? Because, don't want to give away too much to readers, because although, you know what, I will say, even knowing a lot about that history myself, I still found myself with some real jaw-dropping and real poignant tear-jerking moments. So it's really remarkable when history does that to us. And as you say, lessons learned. We don't have to, hopefully future generations don't have to relive them. Such is life. So I'm going to start with a little bit of intros here. So to start with James, James is a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard, the author of Rampage, which was named one of the best books of 2018 by the editors at Amazon, Kirkus, and Military Times, and was chosen as a finalist for the prestigious Gilder Leman Prize for Military History by the New York Historical Society. His other works include Target Tokyo, a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist in history, The War Below, and The Attack on Liberty, which won the Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison Award. Scott lives with his wife and 2 children in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And your amazing books take us into the Pacific during World War II with kind of a stunning realism that I encourage everyone to read. Wow.
Thank you.
Jack, dare I introduce you? Okay.
Please, why not?
For those of you who don't know, Jack Carr, from a young age, had 2 dreams: serving his country in uniform as a Navy SEAL and becoming an author. Following 20 years in the SEAL teams, Jack shifted his sights to publishing and fulfilled his literary objective with the release of his debut novel, The Terminal List. Since then, he has captivated readers worldwide with the gripping tales of James Reese in his New York Times bestselling novels, True Believer, Savage Son, The Devil's Hand, In the Blood, Only the Dead, and Red Sky Morning. The Terminal List was adapted into a thrilling, I can vouch for that, #1 Amazon Prime video series starring Chris Pratt, and has been greenlit for a 2nd season, bravo, based on Jack's 2nd novel, True Believer. And we'll learn about the release date probably when we talk. And in addition, I understand there's going to be a prequel origin story series based on the character Ben Edwards titled The Terminal List: Dark Wolf. And that is starring Taylor Kitsch, and it's currently in production. My goodness, we have so much to talk about, guys. This is really, where do we start? Okay, so I am going to start with just a really simple question that I think readers love to know, which is, because we can all relate to that moment when we were kids, when we read that first book that somehow did something to our brains that either made us want to write or read or both. So let's start with you, James. What was that for you?
Yeah, I think it would probably be Stephen King's The Stand. I just remember being so blown away by that book in junior high school and just the world he'd created and how you could just dive right in and just, of course it's this huge tome, but it pulled me in. And so like every young kid, I went through that whole Stephen King phase after that and then, on to others and whatnot. But I think it was The Stand was the first book that really jumps out at me. It's just grabbing me and pulling me into that world.
Amazing. Jack, what about you?
Yeah, so I mean, I was on that path from a very early age with a mom who's a librarian. So I go all the way back to my side of the mountain, to Abel's Island, to even before that, to Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, Giving Tree. I think all those books that were read to me, and then when I started to read some of maybe the Farley Mowats and the Never Cry Wolf and Lost in the Barrens and that sort of kind of transitional type literature until fifth grade, which I think was where I started to dabble into the same books my parents were reading. Hunt for Red October came out that year. I read it the following year when I was in sixth grade. But sixth grade for sure, I knew that one day after my time in the military, I would want to write. And those books very clear to me. I knew exactly where I was reading the novelization of Rambo First Blood Part 2 by the great David Morrell, who created Rambo in 1972's First Blood. And then Brotherhood of the Rose, also by David Morrell, the Charm School by Nelson DeMille. J.C. Pollock's his series of books. The Centrifuge really stood out for me in the summer of 1986, I think it was. And then Tom Clancy, of course, during that time frame as well. And I started to read all those books on my parents' shelves, the Ian Flemings and the Jean Le Carrés and the Robert Ludlums, and then I've never stopped. So if I could take it back to one specific, it wouldn't be a book. I think it'd be the short story, The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Connell, which I also read in school. And even back then, I knew that one day I would write a novel that paid tribute to that short story. And that was my third novel, Savage Son. So I think that was the one that really cemented me. But I was reading that at the same time I was reading the Nelson DeMilles and David Morrells and J.C. Pollocks and Mark Oldens and all those guys in the 80s that wrote in this genre, inspired me and really became my professors in the art of storytelling. But if I had to distill it back to one that set me on this path, I think it would be The Most Dangerous Game, that short story.
Amazing.
1924, written in 1924, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So here, Jack, this is a follow-up question to you. Then we're going to go to James on this one. But like mentioning short stories is super interesting because, of course, there are all these different mediums that we read and film. People talk a lot about film, but I'm curious for you or whoever wants to answer the question. Any newspaper that you read as a kid or or like a newspaper article that you remember standing out?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I mostly remember the covers because I was reading a Newsweek and Time and any newspaper from Wall Street Journal, New York Times, our local paper that crossed our dining room table where they would sit for a period of time and then they would transfer next to the sofa. And then after like a month or so, then they would, I guess, get tossed out or donated or into recycling or whatever else. But there was this cycle from the mailbox actually the driveway for the newspaper in that case to the dining room table to a little stand next to the sofa, probably onto the coffee table and then out. That's probably something along those lines, though. But specifically, I remember the cover of Newsweek and Time magazine from this event, and that was already on my path into the military. Knew I wanted to do that from a very early age. Back then, terrorism was really in the news quite a bit, especially for a kid in junior high who's watching those kinds of movies, popular culture, reading those kind of books. Once again, popular culture and popular fiction. So to see it in real life, from the Falklands War, 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, what happened in 1980 with Delta Force going in at Desert One, all of those things really stood out to me as a kid. But mostly I remember at that very young age, so I'm 6, 7, 8 time frame right there. I remember the covers of those magazines and newspapers.
Amazing. James.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I started my career as a newspaper reporter. And so, and I got hooked on that because being a kid growing up in Charlotte, North Carolina, my father read the paper every morning before work, and I would come down and actually read it with him. And I'll tell you what, really, I remember being in high school when Waco happened. And I remember following that saga in the newspaper. And every morning I would get up, curious to see what had happened, the day before. And that's kind of what kind of piqued my interest in journalism. And so then when I went through college and did that, I kind of came out of school and thinking, all right, well, I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to, do something creative. And so I ended up as a newspaper reporter. And journalism it's a great venue to teach storytelling, to teach it. You would come back from a meeting, you have just a few hours to produce a story that's going to be on somebody's doorstep the next day. So it teaches you how to write fast, how to write with economy. But for me at the time too, it was also a fascinating way to learn about the world. Having grown up, in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina, I went to work for a newspaper. I ended up working overseas in Argentina. They sent me to Southeast Asia when the tsunami hit. I covered Katrina down the Gulf Coast. I did trips to Iraq and Afghanistan. Newspapers were kind of a great, for somebody like myself with a short attention span, was just a great way to just jump right into a story, to soak it up, to learn as much as you can, and then to turn it around into something that someone's going to read the next day over their coffee. And so I spent the first 7 or 8 years of my career working for newspapers. And so kind of writing books and everything was sort of an extension out of that. And was, as Jack noted, we're going back now in Beirut and looking at these stories that happened during that time period. I remember exactly in being in elementary school when the bombing in Beirut took place, and my parents talking about it. But these were the stories that kind of formed the backdrop and the context of our adolescence in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and another thing that we're talking about it, really that the summer of the Iran-Contra and seeing Oliver North up there, and at that young age, I didn't really understand exactly what was happening. I made my parents buy the Tower Commission report for me. I still have it. I think it came in two volumes, but I had that back then, and I tried to go through as much as I could. But I think that was between 6th and 7th grade, and I'd come home from summer school and turn on the TV. No one else was home as a latchkey kid in the 80s, and I got to see Oliver North in uniform doing that whole thing, and I was just entranced by this whole. It was the first probably scandal type of a thing that I was aware of as a kid, and that one really resonated with me. And I weave little parts into my novels too. I'll put a sentence here or a sentence here from things like that influenced me growing up. But I distinctly remember those the covers of magazines and newspapers from that time frame as well, and then watching it live and trying to understand as much as I could.
And this is so interesting to think about, like us all as little human beings, unaware of the world in which we live, and then suddenly, like you said, what is the guy on the military uniform doing on what is the scandal? What is the terrorist incident? What is the domestic Waco of this? It is fascinating. I think when you write really excellent nonfiction, as you have done, I think it strikes a chord inside of readers where you remember what it means to have your own world interrupted by just the knowledge of some huge event, and then getting the luxury of not having it be your world. We'll certainly, get into that in the book, because wow, did you guys really make me feel that. So when you're not writing, what is the pastime that to either, like, okay, when I finish, I'm going to blank, or what you do to motivate you to write, either or? What's the counterbalance to writing?
Oh my goodness, we might have similar answers to this one, but it's family. It's kind of trying to make up for a little bit of that guilt. I went to Catholic school for the first 3 years of first, second, third grade. That stays with you, I think, that Catholic guilt, so I think it's like, okay, I really have to take a breath here and do something special with the family and make up for all those times where I was up here missing dinners and everything else that I've missed over the last few months, whether it's away doing research or away at a book festival or just here upstairs in this very room typing away. So for me, it's not like, oh, I'm going to travel here, or I'm going to take a break and climb this mountain or do anything like that. It's all shifts to family at this stage in my life.
I'm right there with you. I've got two high schoolers. In fact, school starts tomorrow. My daughter will be a senior in high school. We're very aware this is our last year with her in the house. I've got a son who's going to be a sophomore. I mean, it's kind of like the sand in the hourglass. I mean, my wife and I talk all along about how has this time gone by, and so we just try to maximize it. Go to their football games. Go to their band recitals, things like that. Spend that quality time with them. So
Amazing. What is something that you do in almost parallel of writing? So the most recent, either favorite book, favorite TV show, favorite podcast, favorite album you listen to, in other words, in the same genre of storytelling, what is it that you can point readers to that's just something so we can get a taste of like what you do when you're not engrossed in the work?
Oh, it's always engrossed, and if it's not, it's something that that parallels, overlaps, supports, and for that book, it's easy because it's yours. It's Nuclear War, and I wish it had come out before Red Sky Morning, because a lot of what was happening in Red Sky Morning involves a nuclear exchange and AI and quantum computers, and having future weapons platforms at least have the capability to be autonomously controlled, and what that means when it comes to a nuclear exchange. Luckily, I got most of it right, because I read yours as soon as I was done. That was the first thing I did, was read your book, to have and got to have you on the podcast. And thank you for taking the time to do that. But it's such an important book for everyone to read. So for me, I get a lot of requests for blurbs. And I have a very hard time saying no to anything. So I think I say yes to every blurb, especially knowing that we work in a subjective environment and art form. And so I go through it and try to do as many of those as I can. But it's different than sitting down and reading a book like I did back in sixth grade, which I think is a lot of the benefit to what I'm doing now, is that I got to build this foundation, and it wasn't rushed. It wasn't, I'm 40 years old, I have a family, I have a mortgage, I have a car payment. What do I want to do with the rest of my life? I'm making a transition as far as work goes. There was none of that. It was just sitting down. Once again, as that latchkey kid in the summers between it's the sixth and seventh grade, seventh grade and eighth grade, and sitting there with no filters in place, or very few filters in place, between that page and then my mind as I'm reading those stories. So no preconceived notions, no cynicism built up that perhaps comes with time and experience, maybe. No ulterior motive. I wasn't reading them back then so that one day I could write. I was just enjoying them for the magic in those pages. And there's definitely something to that. So I do miss that. And I heard Lee Child say that right when he was getting ready to turn over the Jack Reacher series to his brother, someone asked him, what are you most looking forward to about retirement? I think they framed it that way. And he said, being able to read for pleasure again. I totally understand that now, because if I'm reading a book for the podcast, I still have to read it fairly quickly because they're coming on soon. I'm taking notes. So there's a motive there. I need to get through it, and I have to ask intelligent questions based on what I'm just reading here. Or if it's a blurb, I'm still reading it very quickly so I can get that blurb out there. Very rarely can I just sit back and open a book and read it for pleasure. So if there was something that I look forward to doing outside of writing, it is reading again, but with that mindset, just to sit down and to read a good book for the magic in the pages, not for a blurb, not for research, not for a podcast guest, just to enjoy the book. So that might not come for a few years. We'll see. There's a lot on the plate, but yeah, there's a lot going on. And then if I'm not writing, also, it's the scripts for the shows, and it's the projects that I have out there. So it's, but I love all of it. That's the great part, is that it's a profession, not a career. And that's why I looked at the military, because it's called the profession of arms, not the career of arms, for a reason. And so I look at these things, there's a distinctly different mindset between something you look at as a career and something that you look at as a profession. So certainly I looked at the military as a profession, which is the same way that I look at writing.
Awesome.
Yeah. I would say, Jack, just like you, I don't get a lot of time to read for fun. Annie, I do have your book on my bedside table, though, which is a treat, because I'm working on a book now on Truman and the end of the war. And so I use my time at night actually to catch up on the secondary literature that I don't have time to read during the day. As a nonfiction writer, you spend all your day looking at documents, going over oral histories, going through records and things like that. And for any project, you'll have 200 or 300 books of secondary lit that you got to get through and make sure you haven't missed anything. And so I spend a lot of my time at night reading those, and I have a pencil on my bedside table. I mark up everything with a pencil. I go through it, take notes and whatnot until literally I often fall asleep in bed with my reading glasses on and everything else. So it's, that's just the phase of life we're in right now. And we're working hard and trying to write books and, write them quickly and accurately. Every hour is, and I've learned over the years. I mean, I've done research and writing in karate dojos in the back of theater recitals and practices. I mean, you just learn, with kids and family that, you got to take every moment that you get when you have a free moment to be able to work because, it's just, there are only so many hours in the day. So.
Is there a literary hero for either of you? Like either a journalist or an author, someone that you just admire deeply, living or dead?
Yeah, I think it would be David Morrell for me, and just his story. Now we're friends, I know more of his personal history. Why a lot of his books were someone in search of a father up to a certain point, and then after a tragedy, why the books after that tragedy were a father in search of a son. So there's so many layers to everything that he does, and he's done so much from writing for really well, comic books, short stories, thrillers. He really moves the genre forward with everything that he does, and that's what I got from him. Is that everything I want to move the genre forward, even if it's by a degree. I think that's what I owe the readers who've trusted me with time that they're never going to get back. Never about chasing the headlines. And though I didn't get this specifically from him, I think everything that he taught me, whether he did it personally or just things that I've read about him and his work, is that it has to be all about the story. It can't be about trying to write something for an audience. It can't be chasing a headline. It can't be any of those things. If you totally devote yourself to the story, then you're honoring that readership that's trusting you with that time. So for me, I think it would be David Morrell, especially for the time in which I started reading his books, right there in that summer between 6th and 7th grade when Rambo First Blood Part 2 came out in the theater. And then I bought the novelization based on the screenplay by James Cameron, of all people, and Sylvester Stallone. So I'd have to say David Morrell.
Tell us one more degree about what you mean when you say he was pushing the genre. What did you see in him? Was it in Rambo?
So in First Blood, which I read after Rambo First Blood Part 2 and after some of his other work, that was a game-changing novel back in the 70s. They taught it in universities. And it wasn't until the movie came out with Sylvester Stallone that they stopped doing it, where it became more of this thing wasn't literary fiction anymore. But they taught, Stephen King taught it when he was teaching his course back in the late 70s or wherever he was teaching.
Wow.
First Blood. And then you get to the 80s, and we have really the US spy genre, which is dominated by Ludlum at the time. And then you get UK spy fiction, which is dominated by Jean le Carré at the time. So you have action over here in the US, and then you have more of this cerebral, morally ambiguous storylines, characters with Jean le Carré. And what David Morrell did is he combined those two things, which no one had ever done before, with the Brotherhood of the Rose. And then that's a trilogy with Fraternity of the Stone and the League of Night and Fog. But he moved the genre forward by doing that, by doing something that no one had ever done before. And so he does that with all of his work, even if it's just by a degree. And so that's something that I've taken from him.
Butting in for a second, I just loved that you shared that with us, because now I'm going to go back and read with that in mind. And I'm fascinated by the idea how someone else's observations on someone else's work brings a whole new POV to the table. James, you were going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Jack, I mean, First Blood is such an amazing book. I bought a copy of that for my son to read this summer because I read it back when I was in high school as well and was blown away by the story of it. And, trying to get kids involved in reading these days. I mean, Jack, you've got teenagers, you know the drill, getting them off their devices, off of TikTok and everything. And, he just finished reading Lord of the Flies for his school summer reading. And we watched the movie last night. Such a great book. Then, but this summer we were going to go on vacation. And I was like, you've got to take a real book. You can't be on your phone and whatnot. And he's like, there's nothing I want to read. And I was like, fine, I'm picking your book. And I ordered First Blood. And sure enough, he read it and loved it. I'm like, it's an amazing book and it's an amazing story. And, getting kids to read these days is so hard. Not to divert onto a different topic, but here we are on the book business, and I'm raising two kids. They're just swallowing so much information from so many different medias, and yet here you are trying to say, all right, sit down with this book and enjoy storytelling again. And so it's going back, quite frankly, to some of those great books, Lord of the Flies, First Blood, to try to find those stories that we can get these kids to latch onto. So it's funny you mentioned that, because that's such a great book.
Oh, yeah. And interestingly enough, like when you think about what you're competing with now as an author compared to what authors were competing with in, let's say, 1985. So as that kid, me with that book, maybe it's competing with a show that's coming on at 8 or 9 p.m. that night, and it's not streaming anytime I want it. I have to wait for The Fall Guy or Magnum PI or Miami Vice or whatever to come on. You can only play Atari 2600 for so long. If there's a new movie coming out, if Predator or Commando or whatever is coming, Rocky IV, whatever is coming out, I can't watch it now on my device or even on my television. I have to wait for Friday or Saturday night when my parents are going to take me and we're going to go together, even as a family. And so different today. Now you're competing with video games you can play for weeks on end, every single streaming service out there, every single social media platform, and you carry this thing around with you all day. And the intent of all of these things is to keep you glued here and not in the pages of a book. So it's a very different medium, which is a reason why doing this is so important, and capitalizing on some of these platforms that allow us to inspire the next generation of readers and writers. But it's so tough. But jumping back to First Blood really quick, I think it also really helped me. I don't think I know. It really helped me when it came time to write scripts for the series or to even be involved in the show, because I knew that my book would change in an adaptation. And I articulated that the first time I talked with the showrunner, and me being okay with that. So I wasn't an author that was going to be a pain on set and say, you ruined my vision, because First Blood, the book, is so different from First Blood, the movie that came a decade later, but both great in their own right. And I loved I love the differences between those. And it also maybe gives us a reason to dive back into First Blood sometime. Quentin Tarantino's talked about it, and doing a more true adaptation to the book where you have two POVs from Rambo's side and then Sheriff Teasel's side also. That's a little more intricate in the novel than it is in the show, in the movie. But it really helped me understanding that things are going to change, and that's okay. We can still make a great show if there are those changes. So I think it really helps in that respect as well.
This is a great segue to talking about what we're here to talk about. But I want you guys to both think about this as we discuss this, because in your answers, I heard loud and clear, both of you speaking about not being afraid of confronting the dark side of being human. And this is something I find super interesting. And James, you mentioned it when you said your one of your kids was reading Lord of the Flies. I'm always amazed by this sort of zeitgeist discussion about violence in books. And when you're writing nonfiction, you're just telling the facts. When you're writing fiction, it's a little more. You can sometimes be, I don't want to say accused, but it comes up in discussion that it's perhaps too violent or something, as if it is. And I'm so glad you mentioned Lord of the Flies. And I recall reading Charlotte's Web to one of my kids when they were like 5, and getting to this really gruesome, dark part where, one of the pigs is going to be put down, is going to be killed. And I kind of tried to skip over it. And my son said to me, Mom, I already know what happens. And he was so matter of fact about it that I made me think, why am I trying to protect him, the little him, from violence? And I've thought about that ever since. And I think about that when we're talking about this book, because there was a couple times in Targeted Beirut where you guys took my breath away with the barbarity. And it was a perfect amount of detail. I say that as a compliment, because this is not easy stuff. Terrorism is not easy stuff. It is not for the weak-minded. And yet you were able to convey it in a manner that had me ripping through the pages. So please think about that. And because you deal so elegantly with this incredibly difficult subject matter. And I want to make sure we cover in the end of our discussions, the end of the book, which is so impactful to me, the epilogue, when you give us this. I mean, it really did bring me to tears hearing some of the way in which you guys were able to convey what people are doing now and how what happened to them impacted their life. Brilliant job. We won't spoiler alert that yet. But to begin with, give me a little bit, or give, all of us an idea about how you two very different, brilliant minds came to work together.
Well, it actually ties into what you just spoke about, and it's being thoughtful with the subject matter and being respectful, because there are people who lost friends, obviously, people who lost sons, people who lost brothers. So for me, it was very important when I came up with this idea. I weave a lot of history into my novels as it is, because I liked that stuff growing up. If I was reading a Stephen Hunter novel and he mentions something, and even if it's just a sentence, it's either in my mind, I remember thinking, oh, I should know about this because this amazing author is writing it in a way that I understand what's happening by context, but maybe they're also letting me know that I should know about this. And maybe I should. So then I do research on the side, and the nonfiction side of the house. So I did do that in my novels as well. I weave history in. So for me, the next natural step from writing thrillers was to move into the nonfiction space. And I saw Tom Clancy do that. If I'm looking at something as a case study, I look at Tom Clancy in the 80s, and he had flagship novels starting with Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising, Patriot Games. And then we get into the early 90s, and he starts to diversify. And he goes into nonfiction with a book called Submarine, and then he has a few others. I forget the like aircraft carrier, like Marine. There's these different nonfictions that he did as well, and he diversified as well with video games, and then we have the movies, and later on the TV show, obviously. So I saw that diversification, and that was always intriguing to me. So I always knew that I would do that. And so in thinking about that next step, then obviously the question is, what are you going to write about? And for me, we talked about it at the beginning, those Newsweek cover and Time magazine covers, and how that impacted me as a young person, and also kept me on this path and into the military, because I knew that my generation's war would essentially be against terrorists, and so that was very clear to me even back then. So for me, and also being a student of history, a student of warfare, and hoping that my senior level elected representatives and senior military leaders will take the lessons of the past and apply them going forward as wisdom. And I saw that not happen for essentially 20 years, and during my time in uniform during the war on terror. And I saw us make mistake after mistake after mistake. You can kind of forgive those early on ones, even though we did have the Soviet experience, particularly in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. And if we drew lessons from that decade, we drew the wrong ones. And we put a very small footprint into Afghanistan initially, and essentially let bin Laden escape. And we were manhunting. This was a manhunt for a singular individual. Later, we ballooned up to thousands and thousands and thousands of troops, well in excess of what they thought at the beginning by putting a small footprint in there. So we didn't take the right lessons, if we took any lessons at all. So for me, I asked myself, what can I do? And what I can do is write nonfiction and try to distill some of those lessons learned, so that a elected representative can read a book like this, like nuclear war. I hope every elected representative reads that book. I hope every military, not even just senior military leader, even those ones that are moving way up, because eventually they'll be senior military leaders, read that book as well. So for this, it's those lessons learned, but also humanizing it, because these are real people, real stories, and people dug their friends out of that rubble, and it's very personal, obviously, for them. So when it came time to think about who do I want to partner with for this, there was one person, James Scott. His book's right there on my shelf, and I didn't even know. Obviously he's busy. He's an amazing author, and so I was like, well, I guess I can swing at it. And it was interesting, because I'm talking to my publisher, my editor, Emily Bessler Books, imprint of Atria, Simon & Schuster, and my agent on the phone. And they said, well, who do you want? They love the idea. And they said, who do you want to partner with this on? And I said, James Scott. And I had all his books right there. And they said, well, who's his agent? And I'm like, well, let me read this author's note or acknowledgement here. And I read a name, John Glussman. And my editor, Emily Bessler, different last name, is like, wait, what? Anyway, they're married. And so we
No way.
got to
No
on the phone
way. No
with
way.
James almost 2 years ago now, and just get to know each other, and then kind of pitch him this idea, and not knowing anything about him personally, just knowing that he's an amazing author, an amazing researcher. And then in our conversation, I also found out he's an amazing person as well. And in that first conversation, I remember talking about how important it was to be thoughtful about anything that we do, and how he was right on board with that from the beginning. And it's been an amazing partnership ever since, and it's grown into an amazing friendship. So that's kind of how how it emerged.
Well, yeah, I'll echo that too and say it was so funny because when Jack reached out, I just read the Terminal List. I just watched I watched the show and I was like, oh, that was awesome. I went back and read the book. And then I get this email from Jack kind of out of the blue. And it's funny because I was on my way up to a conference, and he emailed and he said, I've got this idea for Beirut or whatnot. What do you think? And I literally was like, yeah, I think it sounds great. I'm on my way to a conference. And one of the people at this conference was the former director of Marine Corps history. And so
No
I
way.
asked that. So let me ask you, as former director of Marine Corps history, what kind of records do you guys have on the 83 bombing and whatnot? He's like, we have them all. He's like, that story totally needs to be done. Nobody's done it since, 40 years and whatnot. And I mean, it was just serendipitous that literally Jack reached out right at the time too. And I was getting ready to go and do that. And it's funny because as I was that same weekend, I was literally flying back to the airport. And I remembered a buddy of mine when I did my master's at the Citadel in my class was like, had talked about being in Beirut during this time period. And I thought, Mark had brought up in one of our classes about being in Beirut. And so I texted him, I said, you were in Beirut about the time of the bombing. Like, am I remembering that right? And he's like, texted back, he's like, I was one of the rescuers.
Wow.
And I said, oh my gosh. So I called him from the airport. I said, hey, there's this idea that Jack Carr and I are talking about, and what's your take? Would you be willing to help us out and all that? He's like, absolutely. That story totally needs to be done. And I can put you in touch with the guys I was there with and whatnot. And so it's like all of this kind of came together over literally about like a weekend, And so Jack and I were talking, and then we find out, it was like, this is very much a story. It was almost like it was meant to be, that, all of it kind of came together over the course of literally just, 2 or 3 days. And as Jack said, it's been an amazing journey. The two of us have had a ton of fun working together. Very, very great collaboration. We've had phenomenal cooperation from the folks who were in Beirut, from the family members of the men who were killed, and so I think it just really it's been a very idealistic situation for telling a story about a very tragic event in history. So.
Yeah, and the question of why Beirut, I wrote down initially every terrorist event that I knew about, and then started doing some more research to make sure I wasn't missing any. So I had a full, couple pages of different events and dates. And for me, going back to Beirut, 1983, because that's really where the war on terror starts. I mean, you can go back to 1979, you can go back to some other events here and there, but really go back to 1983 Beirut, starting with the embassy bombing in April, everything that happens through that spring, summer, and then into the fall to October 83 with the barracks and headquarters bombing. And then our response to it and what the enemy learned. So for me, really everything that happens after that, you go back to Beirut 1983. And that was the reason for choosing this particular terrorist event. And also, there wasn't the seminal book on this, that if someone asks you, hey, what should I read on Beirut? There's not the one book that you point them to yet. There's not the one documentary. There's not the one film based on actual events type of a thing or inspired by actual events. Those things don't exist or don't exist yet. And so that was another reason that the Beirut 1983 was the place to start this nonfiction series.
Which is filled with remarkable firsthand sources that take us through this, literally heart-pounding story. So without giving away too much of the book, I'd like to focus on the beginning, because I think, many people like myself in the newspaper remember that image of the Marine being pulled from the rubble, looking like a white, a ghost. post covered in dust that was on the headline of just about every newspaper around the world. But less known is how you begin the book. And now, the first attack, the bombing of the embassy. And so can you tell us a little bit about the sources there, how you were able to reach out to individuals, and just set the stage there, because I think, it's such a bit, people have so many different books to choose from. What should I read next? And I encourage everyone to read this book. And I think, there's so many events in it from the beginning, to all the way through the trials and tribulations of what happened to people involved. But go ahead and tell us a little bit about speaking to sources in that first horrific event, and then we can get into the actual bombing if you don't think it's spoiler alerting.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that and say, one of the things, Jack and I talked about from the very beginning is that, we wanted this to be the story of the survivors and the people who were lost in these bombings. Like we wanted to get out of the way of it. And so, in nonfiction, there's often, you can paraphrase and things like that and sort of tell somebody's story, but you can also quote from them directly, and you can let readers hear from the individuals, because it's far more powerful for them to tell their story directly to the reader than it is for us to serve as the middle individuals and sort of filter it, so to speak. And so from the very beginning, our goal was, let's get as many voices in here as possible. And even if it's like a chapter pull quote at the top, or if it's, some characters obviously are sort of throughout the whole book and whatnot, others just pop in for a quote here, a quote there. But in general, our goal was to try to get as many different voices in the book as possible. And it's not just the survivors and the people who were there. We wanted the family members, we wanted, the spouses, the parents, children, all of that. And so as part of that, of course, that required, a lot of research. We did over 100 hours of interviews with survivors. And each of those interviews we had transcribed. So we had the transcripts of them all to work with. We had the recordings. Everybody you go to, and Annie, this is a nonfiction writer, you're always asking, do you have any diaries? Do you have any letters? Do you have these other materials that capture what it was like at that moment? And fortunately, in today's day and age, I guess down the road, historians will be looking back and be like, do you have that text message? And it's a lot more of, people don't keep those kind of digital communications like they keep journals and like they keep letters. And so we were stunned. We ended up with over 1,000 pages of letters and diaries from people who were in Beirut during that time period. We ended up with recordings, because in a lot of cases, particularly with the Marines, they would record cassette tapes, and they would mail the cassette tape home, and their spouse could listen to it, or their children could listen to it. And so, there were times we were listening to these recordings and you could hear the machinery going on in Beirut at the time period, the earth movers and the equipment and things like that. It was really just transports you back to that moment. And then, of course, on top of that, as a former newspaper guy, I'm always partial to newspapers as a source, because they are, as we used to say, the rough draft of history. And so when a bombing happens, whether it's the Marine barracks or whether it's the embassy, those firsthand reporters who arrive on the scene and who are jotting down their notes about what does it look like, smell like, sound like, those kinds of individuals in those reports were very, very valuable. It's important to remember at this time period, too, how many big names in today's journalism world were young reporters then. Some of the first people, David Ignatius, who's the great columnist at the Washington Post, he'd walked out of that embassy 30 minutes before that building blew up. He's a young reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and he had just gone out. He'd gone over there to interview an attaché, walked out 30 minutes later, the building blows up. It had such an impact on him that if you go to his personal website today, on his About page, it actually talks about being in Beirut right when that bombing went off. Tom Friedman for the New York Times is another one who was there throughout. His own home was blown up at one point in a bombing, and he describes in his wonderful book From Beirut to Jerusalem what it was like, to see his business cards fluttering around in the rubble there. And so, and then on top of all this, of course, then we had the actual official sources and things like that, the Marine Corps documents, the diplomatic traffic and cables, the things that we got from Marine archives, from the Reagan Library, and things like that. The message traffic going back and forth with that day about what was happened, what the who had survived, who was known to have been killed, what the rescue responses were, and things like that. So it was really gathering just all these different types of sources and sort of then synthesizing them down to create the narrative that made it into the book.
Yeah, I don't know if you probably, I'm sure you remember this. It was early on. You sent me an email, and it was a letter that someone had written the day before the bombing, and then a photo attached, like a Polaroid, I think it was. I'm going back a year and a half now, and I remember looking at this photo of this, and he's leaning against a Jeep, and I remember thinking, wow, if I'd seen this photo back in 1983 as a kid, I would have thought how old this guy looks. Oh my gosh, look at this guy. Looking at it now, it's amazing how young that guy looked. Even with like, I think it was the 80s mustache and the whole, like, that really stood out to me. And then that letter, heartbreaking, just to read that, knowing what was going to happen just hours later. So that one really stood out to me early on. I forwarded that on to Simon and Schuster as I was letting them know what we were doing on this book, what we're trying to capture, and the emotions that were going to be woven throughout this narrative. So for me, that stands out. And then juxtaposing it to some of the characters that we all know, like a Weinberger and of course a Reagan and all these people that we remember being in the news, even if we aren't students of history. You kind of, if you're at this age, you remember some of these names from back then in the 80s, and then now seeing just how intricately involved they were in what was happening in Lebanon, and who was advocating to put Marines ashore, who was advocating to keep them on ships in the Med, and those decisions being made in the executive branch, but were fascinating to me.
And you set the stage for this so profoundly with some of the quotes that you have. You ref at the headers of these parts. I'm going to read one of them if you don't mind, because it says so much about the sort of terrifying tone that undergirds this entire narrative. The shark in the water. You have this horrific bombing of the embassy in the beginning, and then to have a second bombing that makes up the scope of the book with, the Marine barracks is just astonishing. And I think for a lot of readers, will not be familiar that there were two bombings, in fact. And I think what undergirds all of this is a quote that you cite from Brian Michael Jenkins' testimony before the Long Commission, November 17th, 1983. And he's talking about October 1983 in Beirut. Terrorists can attack anything, anywhere, anytime. Governments cannot protect everything, everywhere, all the time. It is a certainty that terrorists will attack the least defended target. It is a virtual certainty that there will always be a vulnerable target. Tell us about those people that you were able to interview from the embassy that shared the survivors, the widows. Tell us, what was the one that keeps you up at night still thinking about?
I think the one that, and it's not the one that haunts me the most, is actually not from the embassy. It's actually from the Marine barracks bomb. And I don't know if you want us to go into that.
Yes. Oh my God.
Yeah. In fact, I'll reference it. It's Danny Wheeler, who was the chaplain. And Danny Wheeler was, he was over there, and he was older than a lot of these Marines. And it's important to remember, so many of these Marines at this point were so young. They were 18, 19 years old, and and having a 17-year-old daughter, it really hits home just how young these guys were. And here they are in Lebanon. So he's in his 30s, and so he's older, and so he functions in many ways like a counselor for them. And he's dealing with, their loneliness, their homesickness. He's dealing with all this kind of stuff. And so as a faith leader, he's also sort of a father figure to so many of these young men. And he plays that role all the way throughout. And he does a masterful job of it. And of course, he lives on the 4th floor of the building of the Battalion Landing Team headquarters, which is going to be the building that the terrorists hit in October. And of course, when they do, and the building comes down, he goes from the 4th floor down, all the way down, and he's trapped in this pocket. And he's trapped for hours. underground, and you got to imagine what it's like. Okay, it's you don't even hear the blast. You just wake up. You're sleeping, and you just wake up buried. You're choking on dust because of that pulverized building and all the concrete and the file cabinets and the rebar. You're disoriented. You don't know where you are. You're partly pinned. You're partly not. You can't see much. It's sort of a haze. It's foggy, and you're going to sit there for hours, unaware of exactly what happened. And so he's down there, and he does everything from go through the plots of Louis L'Amour novels that he remembered, trying to think of how his characters had survived this time, when they were trapped in mine collapses and things like that. But in the end, he also comes around and he has this real conversation with God, because at this point he has 3 young children, and he's saying, God, is this your master plan for me? Did you bring me here to kill me? Is this your highest and best use? And what's going to happen to my wife? What's going to happen to my children? He has this real crisis of faith. In the end, he hears this comforting voice of God saying, I've got this. I've got you. Everything's going to be okay. And I get chills right now just remembering that conversation with Danny. And then as he's having this conversation, just this hole opens up above him, and the hands come in, and the guys he can hear them up above, and the muffled voices as they're digging their way down, and they pull him out, and he is the last soul delivered alive from that pile of rubble on that day. And that story, and over the years, I've talked to atomic bomb survivors, atrocity victims, bomber pilots, submarine skippers. I always say that interview with Danny Wheeler was probably the most powerful interview I've ever had. And it haunts me to this day,
Wow. Jack.
Yeah, being able to do this at the tactical level, operational level, and strategic level for me was extremely important. So humanizing it with stories like that people have not heard before. I don't remember ever reading anything like that in any of the history that I've read of Beirut, and the kidnappings and the assassinations and the bombings that were going on all through the 80s. So that story particularly stands out. There was another one we learned about. James had learned about it before, but we couldn't confirm it until we both went out to the 40th anniversary of the event out in North Carolina last year, and we heard from I think multiple people, but about this Marine that got married right before the bomb. And this story about this. So there's a little bit of a love story in there, and then what happens to him, and then tracking her down and making sure that this wasn't an urban legend. And so those ones really stand out. Those things that people were doing right before the bomb went off, or in the weeks prior, or the premonitions that people had, or all those things really stand out to me to humanize it. But also looking at it at the operational level, and having these 2 people who are not trained for anything like this all of a sudden becoming leaders in this rescue effort, dentists, and seeing them stand up and really realizing that, wow, put in this position, thrown into a position you never think you're going to be in, and having to stand up, rise to the occasion, and do the best job you can. And then, of course, the fog of battle and not knowing what's happened, and you're trying to manage what's a mass casualty event, but you're not there on site. You're a little bit removed until you go and see it for yourself. And then that description of what it's like to walk into this thing and see that this building's gone. All of these stories. And then the stories of having to identify the bodies, that stands out to me. Having to figure out who is who and notify the families, that notification process for a mass casualty event. And of course, there's personal touch points with me from the last 20 years when there's a mass casualty event, like with Extortion 17 or something like that, and the command having to mobilize and notify so many families at any given time. And these families back in the United States who don't know if their son dead or alive. And so all those are just, it's a very emotional read. That's for certain. And I think it's important that it's not just something that you're a history of something on the shelf that's not really whitewashed, but told in a way that's just giving facts. And you say 241 people killed. Okay. But when you hear about their personal stories and you get to know them in advance of the bombing, and then you lose them. That really humanizes it a bit more than just knowing that this was a mass casualty event in Beirut in 1983. Okay, check, moving on. What's my next book to read or next thing I'm going to research? It's the humanization of that event. I think that's how really stands out to me about this project.
Oh, I'll say I'll add to that because I mean, for so many readers, they look at it and it's this one event, and but for the people who survive it, this defines the rest of their lives, and time and again in our conversations, was how this one event shapes everything about it. It's a lost spouse, a lost brother, a lost father. I mean, I think one of the most powerful interviews we had was with Lisa Hudson, who's her husband, Dr. John Hudson, was the only doctor in Beirut, and he lived in that building, and he was killed in that blast. And I remember when we were doing our initial interviews, everybody kept saying, like you need to find John Hudson's wife. John Hudson was this big character. You need to find out he's a big part of this story. Because in a lot of ways, he was kind of he understood what was going on a geopolitical level, and he was raising questions and whatnot about what was going on, and so he talked about it and all that, and so people were like, he kind of had his pulse on what was going on over here, and so we managed to track down his widow and call her up, and out of the blue, and we're like, we're writing this story, I know your husband's been gone almost 40 years. Did he leave any diary, any letters or whatnot? And she said, hey, I kept all of his letters, and you can have access to them. And it was 640 pages of his letters. He wrote a letter every single day. And so he wrote a letter, whether he felt good, whether he didn't. He wrote a letter about days that were boring. He wrote about pulling shrapnel still hot out of people's backs. He wrote about having to pronounce people dead after they'd been killed in these attacks leading up to the bombing. But more than that, I mean, Lisa also, how this defined the rest of her life. She never married again. And she told us, we asked her, about it, she said she was and they had a 9-month-old son at the time he was killed. She said, I never met another man I loved as much as John. And so, that bombing would define the whole rest of her life. And for her son, who spoke to the 30th anniversary of the Beirut veterans, he wrote a speech about it. And he actually talked about how it defined his life, never having anyone to ever call dad, never having someone who was going to call him son. And so for so many Americans, this is it's a huge tragic event, but it's in the cycle of day-to-day history and everything else. But for so many of these families, this becomes what defines them. And that's what we wanted to capture in this book, I think, as well, was sort of show how the ripple effect of this one terrorist attack across decades of people's lives.
You certainly captured that incredibly well. And I wrote down a line I'm going to read here because it sums up, I think, what you said. You were talking and you say, each of the people, and you're talking about who died in this bombing, had a past and had been cheated of a future. And the Lisa Hudson part of it makes that so clear. It's so poignant. And it really adds a feeling to the reality of the devastation that this kind of thing happens. And yet we see it, past as prologue. It has a very, very serious sense. And when I'm reading this book, given what's happening geopolitically right now, maybe we save that for later in the conversation, but I couldn't help but think of that. On this note of sources, can you talk a little bit about Colonel Garrity? Because, and I may not be pronouncing his name right, but
you got it. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, what a remarkable story you conveyed about him.
Yeah, Marine right there. We got to spend some time with him at the 40th, or I got to spend some time with him at the 40th in person, and sit with Lisa Hudson. We got to sit with Lisa at dinner. And that's what really stood out to me about having all of those people in that room together at the 40th was how this is like yesterday to them. And then also I can't help but think of my own experience and know so many people who their yesterday is an event that happened 10 years ago, 15 years ago in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that really stood out. So from 1983 to today, and we had people come up to us just telling us stories even at that event that we hadn't heard yet. Almost I mean, it really, really drives home just how impactful this event was. And like you said, multi-generationally, because it's not just going to affect that person. It's everyone in that person's sphere, whether they're a spouse or a child or grandchild, or maybe spouses that would have been that never were because of how they were changed in that event. And that just stood out to me with every single person that we talked to. And then having it at that event and being at that 40th with all those people in one place. So it's not just a singular one-on-one telling you the story, but you're in this environment with people who were there with you, whether you knew them or not. On that day, you had this shared experience that impacted the rest of your life. And gosh, that was just so emotional just to be there. It was hard to hold it together. And it was such an honor to be asked to speak there as well. You're not worthy of it, but to be able to get up there in front of those guys was such an honor. So I could not be more proud of this project and capturing those personal stories, much more so than what was happening in the executive. Although important, it is really how this gets humanized through the eyes of people who were there and who lost friends and brothers in arms.
Yeah, and Garrity, to kind of go back to him, I mean, he was put in such an impossible situation, and he was, this young, dynamic individual who was being groomed for top echelons of Marine Corps command, put in charge of this peacekeeping operation as the entire situation in Beirut is just going sideways. And there's incredible pressure from Washington to use his Marines to change the battlefield equations for the different secular groups that are fighting there, and the resistance that he's trying to push back. And he knows, he says, look, we're tactically in an impossible situation. We're sitting in an airport surrounded by high mountains. I mean, they called it, one of his officers said it best. He said, there hasn't been a worse situation here since Custer. And, they said it another time, this is like being in a fishbowl. And so, they were very resistant to wanting to engage. That wasn't their mission. Their mission was to fly the flag, be a peacekeeping force. But what happened is in Washington, as they were struggling they weren't getting where they wanted to be at the negotiating table with the different groups, and they were wanting to use the Marines as a pressure tool to try to influence things. And when that eventually happened, it put a huge bullseye on these guys. And Garrity, was, as the leader of these 1,800 Marines, he's at the top of that leadership pyramid, and it's all going to come crashing down on top of him. And of course, we had wonderful cooperation from Colonel Garrity. He lives in Arizona. He sat for interviews. As Jack noted, we had a wonderful dinner with him, his wife, his son. This did, really, in the end, he ended up leaving the Marine Corps and going to work for intelligence. A lot of the comments that Jack's made about how this, the lessons learned that weren't learned, Garrity echoes that exact sentiment, because he then used the information he gathered there going into looking at terrorism in the wake of this. And so, and America's failure to respond really sent the worst message. And that's a point that Garrity hammers home a lot. So, but he was a very valuable individual for us in the research of this, without a doubt.
Yeah, and thank goodness, because it could have gone the other way too. When we started doing this research, gosh, he had a rough run of it, and the weight of this, and who knows if someone wants to revisit that. I mean, obviously a lot of years have passed, but what an incredible individual. Just when you talk about taking ownership of something and responsibility for something, and then being able to talk with him. Also, he's such a remarkable individual, and everything that he's done since that time as well really stood out to me as well. So yeah, he's right in here, and thank goodness he read it and liked all on board with everything that's in the book.
Yeah, we sent him an advanced copy of it, so we were
fingers crossed.
I mean, one of these remarkable things was sort of seeing him tangled up in that bureaucracy of it. And then at the end of the book, when you have, I think you're at the 40th reunion, and one of the guys stands up and says, "I will follow you anywhere, sir." And we have, as a reader, you just get that sense of like, hell yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the bad guys in this book, because, the bad guy, the villain, the twirling mustache bad guy, the force that that they're up against. I mean, it's so sinister, it's so dark, and it hasn't gone away. Talk to us a little bit about what it was like digging into that kind of dark-hearted evil force.
There's almost two, and I'm curious how James articulates it here. But we have what's happening in Washington on one side, and then we have different factions vying for positions in Lebanon and in the surrounding countries as well. So, but there, I don't know if I'd call that person an antagonist or a bad guy on the Washington front, but certainly not far from it. But it all comes back to understanding the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged. And we're not very good at doing that in this country. Really, since 1947 onward, we have a hard time doing that for some reason. Like a lot of that's accountability and holding senior level leaders accountable and replacing them when they don't measure up, like George Marshall did in the lead up to World War II and all throughout World War II. But curious what James has to say about that side of things.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you do, as Jack said, there are really two sets here. I mean, number one, it's the birth of Hezbollah. You have at this point in Lebanon, you have all these competing factions. You have the actual central government basically runs the city of Beirut and some of the areas right around it, and that's about it. And so you have this area, the Bekaa Valley, kind of up towards Syria, which is sort of this no man's land. And of course, Iran exploits that, and they set up these terrorist incubator camps up there where they can then take advantage of the fact that for decades, Lebanon has had sort of this religious hierarchy that has placed, Christians here at the top, and then the Sunnis underneath them, and then at the bottom, the Shias. And so Iran can then come in and tap the disenfranchised Shia population and use them as suicide bombers and as a tool to, exploit domestic divisions and execute violence here. And you see it with the embassy bombing. Of course, you see it 188 days later with the bombing of the Marine barracks. And so, and it's a tactic that has played out continuously. I mean, you see it with Hamas, you see it with the Houthi rebels. I mean, this is Iran's playbook. And this is the birth of Hezbollah. And of course, this is going to blossom into the organization the global organization that we now are very, very familiar with. But at that time, the Americans really weren't that familiar with it. It was just beginning, and it begins with just less than 1,000 Iranians that come into Lebanon and sort of start planting these seeds, sort of getting it up and running. And so, of course, they're the ones that are going to execute these terrorist attacks. Now, at the same time, I think you also have good guys and bad guys in Washington, and you have these geopolitical players here. On the side, you've got guys like the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Caspar Weinberger who are saying, you know what, Lebanon is not worth America's clout and prestige. This is the Cold War. This is a sideshow. It's only going to end in badness. We don't need to get involved. And on the flip side, you have George Shultz and you have National Security Advisor Bud McFarland, who are saying, this is legacy building stuff. We can create this peace. It'll if you look at Israel's peace with Egypt, we can do it here with Lebanon. We can create broader stability in the region. It'll be a huge win. And, they start pushing up against the defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, we need your Marines to take a more active role. They need to be combatants in a lot of ways. And they're constantly trying to broaden the rules of engagement for the Marines. And meanwhile, you've got Garrity on the ground being like, no, stop. You're going to put a target on us. And that's essentially eventually what happens when the Marines are effectively backed into a corner and forced to intervene on behalf of the Lebanese army. And Garrity actually tells us his staff after that decision's made, he says, the Corps is going to pay in blood for this decision. And that's the Rubicon that for the Marine Corps that they really crossed in September 1983. And so, they're, like I said earlier, they're in this impossible situation. You've got this dark storm of terrorism that's brewing up along the Syria border that they're not aware of. And then you've got this domestic push coming out of Washington, and caught in the middle of these two titanic forces are 1,800 Marines. And it ends badly.
Yeah, and it was tying into that. It's peacekeeper was something that was said over and over again. It was part of the administration's talking points. We're going to call these guys peacekeepers. We're going to keep saying that word. Of course, there's no social media back then. Very few places that you can refute that. But in talking to these guys were in combat. I mean, they were in combat, and most people they know about, or they remember the bombing in October or sometime in the fall or sometime in the 80s type of a thing. Most people really have forgotten about the embassy bombing, and certainly what happens between April and October, most people have no idea about. And the people that were lost during that time frame, also they kind of get lost between April and October when we talk about 1983 in Beirut. But those guys were in combat. And the administration, I think, did everything that they could to kind of defute that they were actually combatants. But we all know now that they were, and in talking to them, that certainly comes through. They were in combat.
Yeah, and their letters from that time period. Because what was going on too is Reagan was having his own battle against Congress over the War Powers Act. Because anytime troops are in combat, he then has to go and get authorization from Congress. And he didn't want to have to bring Congress in on this. And so it came down to they're not in combat. Well, but they're being shot at. Well, but they're taking indirect fire. And so it became this semantics game of like, well, if they're shooting over the Marines and it happens to land in their compound, it's not actually directed at them. And that was kind of the argument that was being bandied around in Washington. But if you actually look at what the Marines were going through and what they were writing in their letters and in their reports, I mean, they're using 100,000 sandbags a month to fortify their positions because they're taking so much fire coming in. 6 of them are going to be killed. There's many of them to snipers. And so it's this huge, as Jack notes, this huge escalation between April and October, where it's just building and building and building. And these Marines, who go over there as peacekeepers, they're initially wanting to build playground equipment for kids. They're, the dentists are going out, Dr. Bigelow, Dr. Ware are going out. They're doing dental work at orphanages. The hospital corpsmen are doing medical care, and then it just starts going sideways. And they're having to hunker down. They're literally living in foxholes and bunkers and whatnot throughout the whole rest of the period. And they're peacekeepers. But their letters at that time were all about, we're taking fire, and
So what's remarkable to this reader is all of this is preempted by this incredibly violent, incredibly devastating, powerful, bombing of the embassy in April. And tell readers, explain to us a little bit about your take on how the world was or was not different in 1983 in terms of the fact that this was a CIA headquarters and who needed to keep that quiet and why, and how that then impacted the bombing of the Marines.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many lessons from that weren't learned back then and weren't applied going forward just a few months later. But we see that time and time again. We see the things like that with Benghazi. We see those things all around the world, and we see these lessons that we don't apply. And also that bombing, there were car bombings and there were things that happened in the lead up, but that is the one that was the wake up call, or should have been the wake up call in April of 1983. And it also showed what you can do with relatively modest investment of manpower and money to make a tactical weapon that can have strategic level impacts. And from April, that is one of the big lessons that came out of April. And it's one that they have not forgotten even to this day.
And I'll jump in there and add, Jack, it's so surprising because the embassy had almost no security, right? In fact, one of the newspaper reporters right after that talked about, why did our embassy have sawhorses up out front of it instead of like barricades? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't like embassy attacks were new. I mean, the whole Iranian Revolution, I mean, hello, this had happened. But I do think we were entering into a whole new era. I mean, and we were very slow to grasp the target nature of these embassies. In fact, what they did do with that embassy to try to upfit it was they did things like put in ports where you could actually use tear gas and things like that. They covered mylar over the windows to keep them from blowing up and whatnot. But they didn't take the concept of a vehicular torpedo seriously at that point. And it's interesting because Beirut had a huge culture of car bombs at that point. I mean, so much so there was actually a guy in Beirut whose job was the car bomb diffuser, and then he like lost 2 fingers to the job. And the Washington Post did this fascinating profile on him back in the 80s. And because at that point, what people did is they parked their car bomb, they walked away, and they blew it up remotely later. And everybody was used to that. And in fact, the white Mercedes was the most common car bomb. But the concept of a suicide attack at that point was new. And America was slow to grasp that. Even with the car bombs and things like that, we were really slow to grasp it. And what's fascinating is you look at the congressional testimony right after that bombing. Several of the senior leaders from the State Department are there testifying before Congress, and they're asked, hey, how come you guys didn't see this coming and whatnot? And what else are you going to do now to push back on it? And their answer is essentially, well, you really can't stop anybody who's a committed car bomb. There's not a whole lot you can really do about that. And there was, from the very beginning, there was just kind of this, what can we do about it kind of attitude. And I think it really then takes the embassy, the Barracks bombing, which of course is a far larger explosion. It is the largest non-nuclear explosion the FBI has ever seen at this point. I mean, it's multiple times the size of the embassy bombing. That then becomes the wake-up call. And there's no doubt that the U.S. should have seen it coming. I think part of what you mentioned, there was an effort to downplay it because the CIA was the most impacted of the 17 Americans killed. And also of the 63 people killed, the majority of them were not Americans. Had all 63 of them been Americans, it would have made a bigger splash in the U.S. But many of the people killed were embassy staff. They were people waiting for visas. They were citizens, and so unfortunately, the body count wasn't enough Americans for it to have that bigger splash, I think, in the media at the time.
Yeah, Kenny, today we also see that same thing. It's the local populace that pays the heaviest price in blood. We see that in Iraq and Afghanistan too, just over the course of running operations, unfortunately, bombing campaigns and everything else involved. But one of those things that did stand out to me was this industry of car bomb diffusers that you mentioned, and how one guy was kind of the guy to go to if you really wanted it done right. But yeah, all the clues were there to people that were willing to immerse themselves in that part of the world, not just at the geopolitical level, but at the tactical level, and really understanding the cultural sensitivities, Sunni-Shia dynamics, the Christian dynamics. They were there. The clues were certainly there, unfortunately.
I'll add one thing too. There was that fascinating article that Tom Friedman did about he'd gone to so many car bomb scenes in Beirut of just cars blowing up that it had become sort of anticlimactic, that his mind often wandered, that it was less about the car bomb, but he was like, man, that roast chicken that got blown out of that window, it smells really good. Or those smashed bottles of Johnny Walker. Your mind would wander off of the story of the actual bombing to all the random things that came up, because they covered so many of them. There were so many of these car bombings in Lebanon at that point.
The story feels so important in terms of lessons not learned or lessons learned. And again, it's, not to be an armchair general, but you can't help it. I, at times, thought of Black Hawk Down when I was reading, with that same, how couldn't they have seen this coming? The level of violence, and also this idea of, Jack, as you mentioned, a tactical event having massive strategic geopolitical consequences. I was shocked reading this as we all kind of sit in and learning about, reading about Hezbollah and the origin story of that and the bombing and the attacks against Americans, as we kind of sit at the edge of this moment where Hezbollah may attack Israel. What is that like to be having this book come into the universe in a moment which almost feels like full circle?
Yeah. Well, we started talking about this a year before the October 7th attacks in Israel and everything that's transpired since, obviously. And before September 11th, 2001, Hezbollah was responsible for more American deaths than any other terrorist organization out there. And to see them become not just a terrorist organization, but also a political force, which you see in other terrorist organizations as well, both because it gets power to your organization and broadens its mandate and tries to give it some air of legitimacy out there. They're not the first to do it and certainly won't be the last to do it as well. But the seeds were there all the way back in 1983. And now we're seeing that we're on the precipice of possibly another war with this organization that has just grown really since then. So we did get sidetracked with after September 11th, and people kind of forgot about Hezbollah in the United States anyway. People, if you weren't in an intelligence agency and weren't assigned to a desk that was focused on that problem set, then you were focused elsewhere. You're focused in Iraq and Afghanistan, and for the most part, making tactical level improvements or moving the ball forward a little bit at that tactical level, but trying to deal with a terrorist organization that has political clout. That is a problem set that we haven't quite figured out how to counter yet, and we're about to see it come to a head here vis-a-vis Israel and our and the current situation over there. But the seeds right back here in 1983.
Yeah, Jack, I would add, I mean, were you not nervous when they announced that they were going to start putting in a temporary pier and, U.S. ships pulling up? I mean, it was like, this sounds really familiar, from what we've written about is sort of this, it's a mess. Send in the Marines, send in the Navy, and it feels very deja vu.
Sure. Yeah, it certainly does. And once again, it comes back to that, let's say in the executive right there. What's America's role in that area of the world more generally, and specifically as it pertains to Hezbollah. So we haven't quite figured that out yet. But the enemy has learned their lesson, and that lesson is that terrorism works, unfortunately.
Jack, you have such a unique place in the American literary canon. Certainly in the modern era, being someone who spent so much time in the war theater actually operating, and now writing nonfiction. Was this a different experience for you? Like, did you having the hat on of like, wait, this was me and my friends tell us a little bit about that, if you can.
I never stopped reading the nonfiction my whole life. So that whole time I'm reading all the authors that I talked about earlier, I'm also reading nonfiction, everything I can find on special operations, on terrorism, on insurgencies, on counterinsurgencies. And there wasn't that much in the early 80s. There became more and more as we got into the later 80s, into the 90s, even more. But there wasn't that much back then. But I was always reading those things, always, because I figured that was my responsibility. If I was going to be an operator in the future, my responsibility was to have the most solid foundation that I could possibly build, and continue to build on that, of course, through my time in uniform. But that's what I owed the people that were going to be downrange next to me, to my right and left. What I owed their families. It's what I owed the team, the country, the mission, of course. So being a student of history and a student of warfare is a part of it, is part of being the best operator that I can possibly be, just as much as being able to kick in that door and clear my corner and be in the top physical shape and knowing the tactics, techniques, and procedures, learning from the enemy, because the enemy is always adapting to us. We're always adapting to the enemy. Whoever's doing that faster typically comes out on top on the field of battle. But being a part of this now, I knew I had to have James to help me, because in fiction, if I make a mistake, I can just say, oh, it's fiction. Not do that here in nonfiction. You have multiple responsibilities across the board, to the people, obviously, that were involved, to the people who have so generously and graciously decided to spend their time with you and tell their story. And then also just legalities behind photographs, and then annotations, Annie, which I know you know all about, and the indexes and notes and everything else that goes along with a nonfiction that you don't have to think about it all in the world fiction. So there's a tremendous responsibility that I don't feel on the fiction side of the house. The fiction side of the house, all about the story, all about doing the best that I can possibly to making it better than the book before, making the next sentence better than the sentence that I just wrote. So that's the responsibility there. But there's a much heavier responsibility here when you write something like Targeted Beirut or anything in the nonfiction space. So for me, I was a student during this process. I'm always a student of warfare, a student of this profession, writing, a student when it comes to learning about scripts and bringing a show to life and everything involved in that, and certainly here. And I couldn't have had a better partner in that than James, because this right here, this is a lot different than doing the fiction.
Thank you, Jack.
So,
Yeah, I was going to add, I mean, Jack and I had a lot of discussions early on. I mean, these are real stories. I mean, these, when we show up at your doorstep to do an interview, we're here to talk about the worst day of your life. And, and then we've got to translate that into book form and a story, and how sensitive that is. And so it's these kinds of stories, and even as a historian, I normally write about World War II, where so many of the people I'm writing about, Truman, Hirohito, people like that, were gone. So many of these folks, I mean, they're young still. They're in their early 60s. This is still that sensitivity to it. I think both of us, that was a guiding principle throughout this whole process was, you got to get it right. And you've got to be sensitive to the emotional trauma that goes with a story like this.
Yeah, and for me, it's also always about that guy that's in the foxhole, that person at that tactical level who's actually doing the job. So for me, if a general or an admiral doesn't like what we did, that doesn't mean anything to me. What means something to me is that person who is there digging their buddy out of the rubble. If this resonates with them and they come to us and say, thank you for telling our story and telling it in a thoughtful, respectful way, that's really all that matters to me. And there's a quote here at the beginning that I really liked, and it's Beirut is not hell, but you can see it from here. And that's from service members in Lebanon. And when you talk about service members in Lebanon, that you're talking about the people at that tactical level. You're not talking about the generals and the admirals and people in the Joint Chiefs and all that stuff. They certainly weren't saying that. That's the person who is day-to-day standing a guard post out there doing the day-to-day tasks that were necessary for these guys downrange in Beirut, Lebanon in 1983. So to me, that means the most, more than anything else.
When we as readers are going through this book and feel this brutal threat pumping, I mean, that's always what it felt to me. And I know what happens, it made me think about asymmetric warfare and how unfairly stacked it is, if that's even the right way to say it. And Jack, you just said the enemy is always adapting, and you think about that as an operator, and you James, you guys think about that writing and how you're conveying that drama. But then it makes me think this strange truth, because I'm reading the book that took place in the 80s, and I'm thinking about Black Hawk Down. I'm thinking about the various, the embassy bombings in Africa. I'm thinking about 9/11. I'm thinking about all the books I'm going to read in your targeted series that deal with this same asymmetric threat. The car bomb, that kind of tactic doesn't change. And I'm wondering if you felt a sort of exhaustion or a sort of depressive fear in that. It's a little bit about that quote I recited from your book, where you can't defend against everything, and yet the tactic of a suicidal madman on a religious mission, hell-bent for God knows what other than carnage. How do you stand up against that?
Yeah, no, it's certainly something. I wouldn't say there's a depression in it, but it's a pattern. And it's a pattern that's recognizable, and it's a pattern that future leaders should recognize and should incorporate into their understanding of Hezbollah, of that region of the world, or even here, but really, really anywhere. And so that adaptation is so key to recognize and to put yourself in the enemy's shoes, put yourself in their position. So that's why studying the enemy is so important. Go back to Sun Tzu. We can go, everybody knows those adages from Sun Tzu thousands of years ago. But it's true. There's a reason that we can quote that to understand your enemy, and putting yourself in that enemy's shoes, especially if you're a student of warfare, and ask yourself, okay, we did this. Now what are they going to do? What impact are they trying to achieve? So typically, the enemy will plan something backwards, meaning what essential PR outcome are they looking for? How do we get there? Where we go, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to kick this door and we're going to grab somebody out of their bed in the middle of the night. We're going to drag them back. Oh, and if something happened in the meantime, now we're going to deal with it with the public affairs officer. And now we're going to figure out how to frame it. So it's backwards. Those are completely opposite ways of looking at a problem set. So the enemy's looking at that outcome and then working back this way. And we're looking at specific targets. And sometimes we don't even ask ourselves the question of why. So let's say you go after high level leaders of an organization, you target them, which is essentially what we did over the last 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, you remove them. Well, who's that person now to negotiate? Well, not sure. Who's next on the list? And what have they learned by us taking their leader now off the board? Have we made that organization smarter? Have they evolved? Have they adapted now because of what they've learned from us removing this person? So there's a lot more questions to it that future, not just leaders, but everyone in that chain of command, analysts, advisors, and regional specialists, that everyone needs to recognize. But these patterns are there, and also recognizing that, yeah, their patterns are there, but also an enemy is constantly adapting to any changes we make, and they're planning backwards. So that's why it's so important to put yourself in the enemy's shoes.
James, I had a question for you, which I was wondering about asymmetric warfare, because there was a word in the book that stood out, and I thought perhaps it was your choice because of you write about the Pacific and you've written so many books about war in the Pacific, World War II, and the word was kamikaze.
Yeah. I deal with kamikazes.
What? And
I deal
you know a lot
with
about
kamikaze is yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about if you felt any, I'm just thinking of the Battle of Okinawa and the kamikazes coming in, and true asymmetric warfare, and where the goal, as Jack just said, is totally different than the generals at the Pentagon in terms of intended effect. Did this book feel very different in terms of asymmetric warfare, or what was your experience dealing with terrorism?
Yes, that's a good question. And I'll tell you, the kamikazes is an issue I've studied a lot. In fact, I've been to the airfields in the Philippines where the kamikaze force was born. I mean, I've walked those spots, and I'm actually taking a tour next year, leading a tour group over to Okinawa, where we're going to talk extensively about the Battle of Okinawa, because kamikazes play a huge role there. And Jack, I think your grandfather was killed at Okinawa, as I recall, in a kamikaze attack. And so
aircraft carrier that day, and in May of 1945. So when you think about how close to the end of the war that was, it's even more heartbreaking. But the ready room was right there, one deck, midships, and that first kamikaze of the two right there, and he was right under it. So they never actually found the body, which is why he's listed as MIA from that war. And that. I'm gonna have to go with you to Okinawa. I've been there before, but I was I did a deployment there. My one deployment before September 11th was to Okinawa. So it would be, and we just use that as a staging base to go other places. But that'd be amazing to go there with you and walk those airfields. There's a book called The Finest Hour.
Yeah.
follows the creation of the Bunker Hill, and then follows the life of the kamikaze that hits it and how they coincide at this place in the Pacific off Okinawa in May of 1945. It's a remarkable book, but it also reminds me a little bit of the Bridge at San Luis Rey. Have you read that book? It's one my dad read. I think he was in high school, but it's a bridge that collapses, and I haven't read it for 20 plus years, so I might get this a little wrong, but you'll get the general gist. It's, I think, 7 or 9 people. Anyway, there's a group of people on a bridge in South America, and it collapses and they all die. And really, the book is about fate and why these people were on that bridge at that time. And it's really all about fate, which is something I thought of in this context. And then when we talk about an enemy that's adapting, I thought about that in Iraq at the height of the war, where anything could have been an IED. And I actually thought back to my dad talking about that book, and I reread it then, and really thought, you know what, some of this is going to be fate. And as a leader, my job is to do everything I can to support my guys on the way to and from this mission, to prosecute this mission, execute this mission, get back to base, do some interrogations, and go out again. And if I'm worried that everything can be an IED, then I'm not doing my job. We have somebody in the turret. We have some technical countermeasures out there that we need to trust. But my job right now as a leader is not to be looking at that donkey or that pothole or whatever else. My job is different as a leader, getting us to and from that target and making decisions under fire for these guys. So in order to be the best leader that I could possibly be, I thought a lot about fate, and some of that plays into what happened off Okinawa in 1945 and what happened to these guys in Beirut, Lebanon in 1983.
Yeah. Annie, I'll add one thing too. I mean, I do think there's a huge similarity here because kamikazes were essentially a political tool for the Japanese military at this point. I mean, the Japanese were defeated by the time of Okinawa, and what they were trying to do is they were effectively trying to bargain for a better position at the surrender table. And they did not like the unconditional surrender, and they were trying to grind down the Americans through attrition, and so that they could have a better position there. And kamikazes were a tool of that. They were utilizing them as they terrified the Americans. They were a brand new, I mean, it was very much against the American way of life to kill yourself in a plane like that. You look at the tactics like the bonsai charges, the kamikazes, the aerial kamikazes against B-29s. Again, all of this was attrition oriented to grind down the Americans and really to affect the American home front resolve to continue to prosecute the war in the Pacific to the end at unconditional surrender. Same thing happens with terror bombings like that in the Middle East. I mean, these are political tools. I mean, the impact of the Beirut bombing was to push the Americans out of Lebanon, to give the Iranians and give Hezbollah and Syria a greater control there. And in the end, it worked. After this huge bombing, the Americans say we're going to stay. Reagan says we're going to stay. But then, the situation in Lebanon continues to deteriorate. And then quietly in 1984, we pull the guys back aboard ship and we head out. And Lebanon continues to deteriorate to the position it's in today. Same thing, kamikazes in World War II, kamikaze bombers here. They were tools designed for a political end. And so I do think there's a lot of similarity there.
That definitely stands. It's not the first time that the United States talks tough as a nation through our leadership, of course, our elected representatives, I should say, and then does something different. And the citizenry we're not the only people to notice that. Probably the enemy notices it even more than we do. And that paper tiger that keeps coming up time and time again when our adversaries talk about us in their speech as well. There's a reason they call us a paper tiger, and this is one of them, one example. But it's certainly an example that they learned from and they capitalized upon, both in their rhetoric and in their actions.
Which makes me think that, reporting any book or writing any novel is it's like a massive undertaking. And so much of it, as we've talked about, is like technique. You just go to the mats and you keep going and you keep going and you interview and you report. And then there's like the deep breath moment where you get to where you guys are at now, where, this book, and it's an incredible book. I mean, it's about to come out into the universe. I was lucky enough to get to read an advance copy. Thank you. So it's like you get, even though you have all the excitement of interviews that you're going to do, there is a little reflective moment. What is that for you, for each of you? Like
Well,
the takeaway that makes you either say, I'm so glad, what is the thing that's like you didn't expect?
well, for me, I mean, I went into this kind of knowing who I'm working with here, and knowing that James is going to knock this out of the park. But to have it exceed expectations in exactly the way we talked about in our first conversation, when we talk about that thoughtful aspect and that respect, and capturing and humanizing those stories for future generations, and those lessons learned, patterns like we just talked about. So the reflective moment for me is like, wow, this exceeded all my expectations, as did working with James, because I didn't know him at all other than from his work, like I talked about. And he could have still written a great book, but not been the amazing person that he is and friend that he now is. So the reflective part for me is we did it.
Wow.
Amazing. Could not be more thrilled with how this came out, but that's 1 second, and on to the next. So there's the only reflection comes with how do we do it better next time.
I was gonna say, Jack, you're already like, like we got to get started on the next one. What's our schedule for that? Like we're like, it hasn't even come out yet.
I'm already switched gears.
We had a conversation earlier this week about FOIAs that need to be filed, things that need to be done. I was like, this book isn't even out yet, and we're already plotting.
Freedom of Information Act requests. We got to get those in now. It takes so long, and even if they don't, even in the couple-year process, this is going to take for this next one, and we haven't announced what it is yet. But even in that time frame, we might still not have them by the time that book publishes, which also is something to write about and write into that story as well. The why behind these things being classified. Annie, as you know, from your latest book and your other books as well. But how long those things take, and then the why behind these things being classified, that's a part of the story. So yeah, we're already thinking about that next one.
And Annie, you got to understand one thing is Jack doesn't sleep. I mean, he works.
I knew it. I knew it. I absolutely knew it. Thank you for confirming.
I'll hear my phone ding at 3 o'clock in the morning on my bedside table,
turn your ringer
texting me, and I'm like, "Why are you still awake?"
Turn your ringer off. It's just before I forget something.
Well, it vibrates. It's like, but I mean, he's, to produce what, 7 books in what, 6-7 years now 8 books. How many TV shows? Terminal List season 2, Dark Wolf season 1, 2, a couple other shows out there. I mean, it's like, how you do it. I mean, it's like, I mean, you have brought a SEAL's tenacity and endurance to the writing world, and for us mortals, it's we have to keep up.
No, not at all. I mean, it's an honor to be here with both of you on that. But when I initially pitched it, Annie, I told Simon and Schuster, and this is before I talked to James, I pitched it as a 1-a-year nonfiction book that looks at a different terrorist event and dives into the tactical, operational, strategic parts of the event and lessons learned as well to capture those for future generations. And I pitched it as a 1-a-year thing. And I think it was in probably the first couple weeks after we talked, or maybe it was up 2 months. I forget now. Things are conflating a bit. Soon after we talked and got on this path, I realized that to do these stories justice, it's going to take 2 years. It's going to be a 2-year thing. So I called Simon & Schuster back and I said, hey, I know the contract says 1 a year, but it's going to be 2. And we're not rushing with these things. And in order to give them their due, and especially with a book like this that has so many contemporary reverberations and so many people that are still alive that were involved in the event or impacted by the event, to really do it justice, you need to give it the time that it's due. So now it's going to be every 2 years, but now I see the research that goes in and what you need to do to confirm everything that's in here. You just can't take it, Annie, as you know, but for those watching or listening, you just can't take one story and put it in here without confirming that story. And just kind of like with intelligence as well, it's like single source intel, or if it is, you have to frame it as such. But you don't even though we launched a war essentially on single source intel in Iraq, aside from that, later on in the war, we would not be able to go after, say, an IED maker with the kind of intel, the level of intelligence that essentially we launched a war on. So you have these different levels for those that are listening that sources kind of fit into, if they've reported before, if that information was accurate, and they're kind of ranked like that. But yeah, there's no single source intel. You have to confirm everything like a journalist does, and it has to be right, because people are going to go back to this book 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and cite it as a source for things. And so it has to be right.
And Annie, that's the thing. When we first started talking about this, it was like, there's some nonfiction projects out there that are just sort of copy and paste from secondary sources. You take 20 books and you just can synthesize and you jam them out. And I mean, from the very beginning, Jack and I were like, you know what, that's not the route we're going. I mean, these are going to be reported stories, in part because a lot of them, there is no secondary literature. I mean, there are very few books on a topic like what happened in Beirut. And so you really do have to report them out. And that's the 100 hours of interviews. That's the finding the letters. That's the finding the diaries. That's going through all the Marine Corps message traffic, the command histories. It's going through all of Reagan's diaries and his, the National Security Council meeting minutes and agendas. I mean, there's just so much primary source material. And the great thing is, I mean, the end result of this book is literally about 90% of that book comes straight from primary sources. And the only secondary sources we really used were memoirs of participants who were there, because quite frankly, there is no wealth of pre-existing literature on this topic to draw from. I mean, we really had to kind of chart our own path here. And that's the awesome thing, because it gives us this opportunity to like tread this new ground and to go out and find these stories that are sort of on the cusp of current events and history. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we all lived through this. We all remembered this. My kids, I mean, I look at, for instance, 9/11, my kids were born after that. To them, that's ancient history. I mean, anything that happens before you're born, it's history. These are those events that are still in our lifetimes, but are just now moving into the realm of history. And we're also, as a result, we're running up against the declass issues, because some of the documents we want are still classified. And then given the pandemic, the declassification has slowed down. But we're having to sort of chart these topics on our own and build the literature and build the document bases and things like that are going to make it.
And 2 years is even ambitious. Now I realize how ambitious 2 years.
That's what I'm secretly trying to communicate to you here.
But this is I'm gonna pipe in here because this brings us around full circle to how we began the conversation when you were talking about genre busting, and the David Morrell novels. And what's interesting to James and I, right? Because I'm sure I think it's terrific when someone comes in and shakes it up a bit, and your enthusiasm. I think we can both echo your discipline as a SEAL, and your enthusiasm for history and for literature adds a really cool component to the let's do it faster idea, because there is in our world of nonfiction an idea, maybe perhaps among a certain set of people, that things should take longer. And I often go up against that because I meet colleagues that release books once every 5. I write a book every 2 years, and I'm considered like quick draw. And now I've got you to compete with. I love a competition. So James, congratulations. But it makes me laugh. But I also love the fact that your first thought was, let's do it once a year. Because, and then, oh, wow, calling up Simon.
Talked about adaptation.
I'm going to take one step back. But don't go too far back, right? Because I think it challenges the rest of us. And I also love the fact that you have all these other projects, because James and I are both pointing out, and yes, nonfiction is a slog, and it is important for that reason. I mean, the precision that must go into the notes, and when you're going to the first hand sources and you're knocking on the doors and you're picking up the phone, it is so important. And at the same time, we're all of us in this room are building on the shoulders of other people who have written great books about them. You know, I noticed like Fred Burton and Samuel Katz's book in your notes about, and they came at it from the intelligence point of view, but certainly not that firsthand witness that makes this book so powerful. And I'm just citing one source because I always feel that same way in my own books. You want to let everybody know, including readers, if you love this subject, go to my notes and see what else is out there. And so it all kind of works together because you're moving, it's the old lessons learned. So on that note, what is a final thought for you on, like, and this is such a strange history repeats itself question, but I often think about war, and it's why we keep having wars, why we keep having conflicts. Anything stand out for either of you in this particular book that may have shifted an idea that you had before?
Shifted an idea that I had before.
About what war means, like what.
Certainly, it is part of the human condition.
Mm.
And this book, we didn't need this book to confirm that. We just need history. We just need an understanding of a basic understanding of history to talk about that as war as a basic component of the human condition, unfortunately. But for me, it goes back to wisdom and what our senior level military leaders owe that E1, E2, E3, E4, E5, E6 that's going to be standing guard with a rifle at a sandbagged position outside an embassy, outside the forward operating base somewhere in the world. And so for me, it comes back to those lessons learned, and for that senior level leader to not forget about that guy, to not forget about that E3 that's standing there, that's 18 years old, a year out of high school, 19 years old, 20 years old, first time away from home, first time outside of the United States, that's standing there with a rifle that might not be the best, certainly not the ones that the guys at some of our more senior special mission units are using. And they're standing there, and they are the last decision maker in a chain that goes all the way up to the president of the United States. And it goes all the way down, and that is the final decision maker, that person with his finger on the trigger as a car is pulling up that looks like it might be a little low on that suspension. Is it just bad suspension, or is that a car bomb in there, or is it just a family with a bunch of kids in the back? And this is the final decision maker. So I would hope that our senior level leaders will read books like this, Nuclear War, yours certainly, they should all read, and then not forget who's at the pointy end of that spear and who's the final decision maker in a chain that's going to start with them up at the executive and work its way down.
It's really, really well said, Jack. Really, really powerful. I would add, you're absolutely right. I mean, history, our first historians all the way back to Herodotus and Thucydides were writing about war. It is part of human nature. One of the things I take away from this is exactly what you said, is so many of these situations, like what happened in Beirut, happen at the intersection of combat and politics. It's Black Hawk Down, it's Benghazi, it's Beirut. These are situations where guys in harm's way are affected by decisions thousands of miles away in Washington. And, I'm reminded of that, throughout Beirut. I'm reminded of that in Black Hawk Down, when that great line, I'm talking about the movie here, when he says, Washington with all of its infinite wisdom chose not to give us gunships, and it's just like some bureaucrats making a decision about rules of engagement. And it's, how is that translating out in the dusty plains of Beirut and whatnot? And so it's that unfortunate intersection of combat and politics.
It's not going away.
Mm-hmm.
Where can readers see you guys on book tour? Can you tell us a little bit about upcoming events, when the book publishes, and where we can find you?
Yep, September 24th. So this podcast will drop right before then. And by that point, the book tour will be out on my website, officialjackcarr.com. It'll probably be on James's website. It'll be on my social media. There'll be many places where people can find out about where we're going to be and who we're going to be appearing with. We're working through that right now. By the time this podcast drops, we'll know exactly who's going to be joining us, but we're hoping to have some of the survivors with us so they can tell their story in their own words. And once again, it's us getting out of the way. So this will be a different book tour than I've done in the past. And it'll be focused on these guys and these stories so we don't forget those service members who are that last line of defense.
James, final thoughts on what this book tour is going to be like with Jack? Is he going to steal the show? We know he's a celebrity, so...
No, actually, as Jack said, I mean, we're going to launch the book in Charleston, here in my hometown where I live, and we're going to be joined by 3 survivors at that event. And during that event, Jack and I are actually going to interview them on stage. And
wow. Wait, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that's kind of bringing back, it's a genre busting move in its own way. It reminds me of the old days of, symposiums and forums, which are so powerful. How did you guys come to that idea?
Well, again, this whole book has been about getting out of the way of the voices of the people who were there. And so we're just translators of their story. And so we've got, right here in the Charleston area, we've got 3 dynamic individuals with incredible stories. Dr. Jimmy Ware, who was one of the dentists who led the medical rescue effort, lives in Savannah, Georgia. He's going to come up and join us. We've got Don Howell, who was a Navy corpsman who was buried in the basement of the building. He's still blind in one eye from where the debris hit him. He had to dig his way out. He's going to join us. And we've got Mark Singleton from right up near Myrtle Beach is going to come down. Mark was one of the principal rescuers who dug on that pile to get people out. He's also one of the first people wounded in the summer of 1983 as the violence really escalated. So 3 very unique, very important perspectives. And again, I think, it's for audience members are going to want to hear from them more than they are us. I mean, we're just translators of their story. And so that's kind of the approach we're trying to take with this is, some of these guys they're around and about, they want to tell the story. We want to help them tell their story any way we can.
Fantastic. Jack, do you have final thoughts for us on this book, this experience?
Just that it was an honor to work with James, and I'm so excited for what's ahead. And then, I mean, I don't even know. I haven't really quite processed. When you asked me before about how long I've reflected on it, and I said it was like 1 second because there's so many other things going on. I've shifted to our next book already. But I think once we go through this book tour and see people's reactions to this, I think it'll sink in a little more. But for me, I feel so proud of this book and what that we were able to capture these stories in a way that that the people who were there are proud of. And to me, that really says it all.
Amazing. You guys keep up the good work. I can't wait to, I hope you'll have me back to do the next of the targeted series.
I can't wait for your next one as well. I'm excited to see it in the works.
I'm not asking you about the next targeted series on purpose because I really want readers to focus on Beirut and read it. It is such a powerful read, and it has left me thinking deeply ever since I finished reading it, which is always a hallmark of a fantastic book. So well done, both of you.
Thank you. That means so much coming from you, Annie. Thank you.
It really does. But I'll put you on the spot. What do you have in the works coming up here into the fall and the winter and into next spring?
Next book tour. I'll tell you about it.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for all you do. If people have not read all your books, they're right there on the shelf behind me. And we talked about them on 2 podcasts that we've done together in the past. So both James's other books up there and your books right here should be on everyone's shelf and part of everyone's library. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know how busy you are with everything. And now I understand how much goes into the nonfiction world when you're putting together a book like this. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us today. It's sincerely appreciated.
Thank you guys. Have a great book tour.
Thank you, Amy.
Bye.
Thank you for joining the JACK CARR Book Club. Go to officialjackcarr.com to learn more, including where you can add these book club selections to your library for 15% off while supporting independent bookstores. Be sure to join me and fellow authors and readers at JACK CARR BOOK CLUB on Instagram. And if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. Until we turn the next page, stay sharp, stay true, and keep reading.